There is a moment in 1986's Transformers the movie where the matrix of leadership is passed on from the hero of the show, Optimus Prime. And now the good guys, the Autobots, are on the run. They're leaderless. They're largely dead or scattered. And their makeshift leader, who isn't really that good at leading, even though he has an awesome voice, is Robert Stack. And this character's name is Ultra Magnus. And Ultra Magnus has his back up against the wall, and the bad guys are closing in, and he pulls out the Autobot matrix of leadership. And attached to this matrix of leadership, there's like a prophecy, a promise that says that this thing is going to light the Autobots' darkest hour. And Ultra Magnus is like, this has got to be it. Look at this. This is the darkest hour. And he gets it out and he's pulling on the thing and he even swears. You can't swear in a kid's cartoon movie. That was the first time I'd ever heard that. I was scandalized. But the thing doesn't open. And then he gets shot a whole bunch. And I was like, what the heck, man? Why even have a prophecy if it's going to be that vague? How could that not be the darkest hour? Come on. And then later the thing does open, but it opens for Hot Rod, who is lame, and that was a disappointing ending for me. But that motif of the light your darkest hour, the prophecy thing, but you don't know exactly when the darkest hour is going to be because it's intentionally vague, feels like that might be a little bit in play in Matthew chapter 24. Jesus is speaking about the future and how things are going to work out. And we know, it's really easy to tell contextually, the first chunk of his answer to the disciples about what the signs of the end of times are going to be, those just look like road markers. Like all of this stuff's going to happen. It seems like they're going to be really big deals, but don't panic too much about that. That's just cost of doing business in the world system. That doesn't mean the end is here. So when Jesus says, watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Christ, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. It makes sense then that Jesus would go on to say, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen. And then he lists out a few more things that are going to go down just along the merry way of history as well. But then as we get into this next chunk, it's a touch trickier. Is Jesus now pivoting to specific things that are going to happen to the disciples, and that means it's the end of time? Or is he still talking about things that are going to happen along the way, except instead of generally these things will all just happen along the way of history, he's saying these things will happen to you along the way. Be ready for that. But these things are not necessarily indicative of the end of everything. So to jog your memory, in this next chunk, Matthew 24, starting in verse 9 of the Olivet Discourse, it looks like Jesus is redirecting his attention away from the general and toward specifically the disciples who are standing there with him when he says, then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me. At that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other, and many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold, but he who stands firm to the end will be saved, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached to the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Well, there's a really tricky word in there, isn't it? It's then. And that then sort of corresponds to the vagueness of the matrix of leadership will light the Autobots' darkest hour. Well, when is then? When is the Autobots' darkest hour? Because it looked like it was really dark when Ultra Magnus was getting shot again and again and again. But it turned out that that wasn't the end of things, and the matrix of leadership didn't open. Tough luck, Robert Stack. And likewise here, then could mean after you've driven down the road and you've seen some of these road markers that you just can't help but see throughout history that Jesus talks about in the first chunk. It could mean after that, then these things will happen, and that is the end. Or it could mean, as some hyper-intelligent Bible scholars argue is the best reading of the original language, that, quote, then should be interpreted as something more like in keeping with or along with that it isn't necessarily a chronological order of events. And I've got to say that read is pretty compelling because if we take what we just read between verses 9 and 14 about all the things about people's hearts getting cold and people turning away and being handed over and persecuted and all of that, if we line that up against the last 2,000 years of history, well, it corresponds to like always. Like somebody is always experiencing apostasy in the church. Churches struggle, churches thrive. Nations get mad at Christians. Christianity is almost always out of vogue somewhere. So when you go and watch Transformers the movie, you could be like, oh, that right there, that's the darkest hour. Look at that. They're in a tank with a bunch of shark robots. That's as dark as it gets. Well, I guess not. Oh, look at that. Like the bunch of junk bots are chasing everything. That's got to be the darkest hour. That's terrible. No, well, no, I guess not. Oh, I mean, for crying out loud, it's like the destruction of the shuttle and everybody's getting shot. That's got to be. No, but that wasn't it either. That giant planet is eating other planets. That's got to be. No, that wasn't it either. But then when the matrix of leadership finally does open, you're like, oh, well, I guess I could see it. I suppose that could be the darkest hour as well. Likewise here in Matthew chapter 24, let's say we just look at the first century AD and what we know about what happened to the disciples over the next several decades after the events recorded here in Matthew chapter 24. Let me see. Were they handed over and persecuted? Oh, yeah, for sure. Like, I barely even have to turn any pages. Like, just right here at the beginning of Acts, like, it's immediate how quickly they're getting turned over and persecuted. I mean, they got flogged. They get their backs turned into hamburger by religious people. So that checks out. But, I mean, it also checks out for Christians in the 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century, 5th century. You get where I'm going with this. And let's keep reading and see how the rest of this checks out. And you will be hated by all nations because of me. Well, I guess by the end of the 1st century, people in charge of every nation that was exposed to Christianity seemed to hate Christianity. I mean, the persecution was certainly really thick in the 1st, 2nd, and even 3rd century. The 4th century, though, when Constantine legalizes Christianity in the early part of the 4th century, and then Theodosius in the latter part of the 4th century makes Christianity the official approved religion of the empire. Like, that doesn't seem like all the nations are hating there. So I don't know. It looks like that would align with a lot of moments in history, but maybe not every moment in history. Let's keep going. At that time, many will turn away from faith and will betray and hate each other. I mean, every century has that. Many false prophets will appear. I mean, that's happening in the 1st century. We've got stuff about that still recorded to come yet in the New Testament. The increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. Paul seems to be writing about that kind of stuff in Romans, but he who stands firm to the end will be saved. That smacks of a whole bunch of other Bible language as well in the New Testament. I don't know. My point is, it's pretty hard to pin this on like one exact place and make the argument like, oh yeah, all of that happened, and therefore the end of time as Jesus conceived of the end of time, that happened a long, long time ago. That all took care of itself in the 1st century. And I think that gives weight to those scholars who argue that in this second chunk of the Olivet Discourse, even though it's targeted at the experience of the disciples, it's still descriptive of a reality that's going to be recurring for a very long time. And you're not going to have clarity on what is light or darkest hour until after the fact. In further support of that, read that this is sort of an ongoing description of things that won't just happen to this round of disciples who are sitting there with him, but that will happen to future disciples. We got to remember that according to John 17, at this time in Jesus' life, he had future believers in mind. In John 17, right after these events, he goes and prays, and in that prayer, the last thing he prays to his Father is for people who will believe through the testimony of the disciples who were physically following Jesus around right then. So Jesus anticipates a future church. He anticipates this thing going on for a while, and if there's any debate about that, we look at these last couple of verses of what he says in this chunk, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Matthew 10, you'll recall the missional discourse, suggests that the disciples are going to go out with this message, the message that the kingdom is at hand, the same message Jesus is referencing right here in Matthew 24, and that they're going to do that for a long time, and that they're going to suffer a pretty difficult fate and all kinds of persecution for it. So like we talked about yesterday, this does feel like a double down on Matthew 10, but it also feels like an anticipation, a look forward to what Jesus says in the thesis verse of the book of Acts. In Acts 1:8, the disciples have all gathered around Jesus. He's back to life, and he's fixing to go to the right hand of the Father and leave them there to figure it out. And finally, they can't help it anymore, and they're like, oh, but like before you go, we're going to have a reckoning, right? Like now we were going to restore Israel and be vindicated. Like it kind of feels like it's the last minute, so we were going to do that, right? And they should have known better, because Jesus told them in chapter 10 of Matthew, Jesus told them here in chapter 24 of Matthew that No, the message of the kingdom is going to go to everybody first, and that's your job. And specifically, he says that in Acts 1, 7 and 8. He said to them, "It is not for you to know the times or dates the Father has set by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem," and then the larger area, Judea, and a neighboring regional area, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And then he says that, and then he ascends into heaven. It seems, once again, crystal clear that Jesus' first chunk of answer to the question the disciples asked, which is, tell us, when will this happen? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? His first chunk of answer is all this stuff's just going to keep happening. Like, just this is just how the world is. Get used to it. You don't need to be alarmed when you see the normal unfoldings of the world, even though those normal unfoldings can be pretty cataclysmic and ugly and scary. Then, I think in the second chunk here, he is speaking directly to his immediate followers and reminding them, like, remember, I told you that this was going to get tough, and it is going to get tough, and you're going to be discouraged because the church is going to flail at times. It's going to seem like the outside world is really tough on Christianity, and it's going to seem like Christianity can't get out of its own way and is really tough on Christianity. And even though this might seem like light our darkest hour, this has got to be the darkest hour, it's still not. This is just a thing that they are going to have to go through, but that the timeline is more oriented, according to Jesus, based on his followers and the descendants of those followers spiritually going out and pronouncing that message that John the Baptist said in the very beginning, in Matthew chapter 3, and that Jesus repeated right after that, which is, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. What percentage of planet Earth has to hear in order to trigger Jesus initiating the end of all things? I don't know. I'm not sure it really works that way or can be calculated that way. I mean, we did just look at Acts chapter 1, where Jesus starts his remarks in verse 7 saying, it's not for you to know the times or the dates my Father has set by his own authority. So Jesus seems to be pretty clearly intent on giving his disciples enough not to freak out, to stay steady and steadfast and targeted, and enough for them to brace themselves for the difficult things that are coming for them and in a larger sense of planet Earth. But the whole work here involves articulating the glory of God and the message of his kingdom to a whole lot of people. And at least at this point in Matthew chapter 24, and at least in Acts chapter 1, there's just still a whole lot of history to unfold and a whole lot of people who need to hear that stuff. And that is the job of people who are ambassadors, sons, daughters, heirs of the kingdom. And we'll roll into the next chunk of his answer next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.